Why you feel disconnected from modern life. The glass wall. You are surrounded by people and you still feel like you are watching everything from a slight distance. Not far enough to explain to anyone who has not felt it themselves. Not close enough to disappear into the background and stop noticing. Just enough to make you wonder, in the quiet moments after the noise finally stops, whether you have ever truly been inside your own life, or only ever adjacent to it, present in body, while something essential remained just outside the frame. That feeling has probably followed you for longer than you can accurately trace. Through conversations that ended and left you feeling emptier than before they started. Through rooms full of people where you performed every social cue correctly, and still drove home with the distinct sensation that none of it touched you. Through periods of your life that were, by every measurable standard, fine, and yet carried this low, persistent hum of something being fundamentally off, as though the world you were inhabiting was a very convincing replica of a place where you were supposed to feel at home. You have tried to explain it, maybe to someone else, maybe only to yourself in the particular silence of 3 a.m. when the performance is over and there's nothing left to maintain. The explanation always falls short, because the experience is not sadness exactly, and it is not loneliness in the way people usually mean that word, and it is not depression in the clinical sense, though it borrows textures from all three. It resists the vocabulary available to it, which may be part of why it has followed you so quietly for so long. Most of what the world offers as a solution will not reach it. The advice about phone use and morning routines and gratitude practices, all of it is designed for a different problem. A shallower one that lives on the surface of a person's life, rather than in the architecture beneath it. You have tried the surface solutions and felt the disconnection waiting for you on the other side of every one of them, patient and unchanged. What you are carrying is not a habit to be corrected. It is a signal. And signals do not disappear when you ignore them. They only become harder to misread as anything other than what they are. This is not a video about fixing your relationship with modern life. What it is going to do is take seriously the possibility that your disconnection is not a malfunction, that it is a precise and coherent response to something real, that the part of you which has never quite settled into the shape the world keeps offering you is not broken, but is perhaps the most honest thing about you. But before we can get there, we have to look at what modern life is actually asking of you every single day, and what it quietly costs to keep saying yes. The performance of presence. There is a version of presence that the modern world rewards, and it has almost nothing to do with actually being present. It has to do with looking present, responding at the right speed, laughing at the right moments, producing the correct facial expression for the emotional register of the room, showing up to the conversation with enough energy to make the other person feel received, regardless of what is actually happening inside you while you do it. Most people learn this so early and so completely that they stop noticing the gap between the performance and the experience beneath it. The two layers collapse into each other, and life becomes something you move through rather than something you feel, which is, in a specific and unspoken way, exactly what the system requires. A person fully absorbed in the surface has no attention left over to notice that the surface is all there is. But you noticed. You noticed the gap between what people were saying and what they meant. You noticed the way conversations operated on invisible social contracts that everyone was following, without anyone having agreed to them out loud. You noticed the performance in other people and, with a particular kind of dread, you noticed it in yourself. The micro-adjustments, the self-monitoring, the constant low-level calculation of how much of what you actually thought was safe to say in this specific room to these specific people at this specific moment. And once you saw it, you could not unsee it. The machinery of ordinary social life became visible in a way that made genuine participation feel increasingly complicated, because you cannot fully dissolve into something you can simultaneously observe the mechanics of. The distance that creates is not chosen, it is structural. It is what happens when a mind precise enough to see the scaffolding tries to also live inside the building. Modern life is built for a kind of engagement that moves fast enough to prevent that kind of noticing. The scroll, the feed, the constant low-grade stimulation, all of it rewards reaction over reflection, volume over depth, immediacy over meaning. And for people who are wired for the second thing in each of those pairs, the environment does not feel like a place to inhabit. It feels like a demand to perform a version of yourself that requires leaving behind the part of you that actually processes experience. The exhaustion you carry is not the exhaustion of someone who has been doing too much. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been doing two things simultaneously for years: living and narrating the living in real time, monitoring and adjusting and translating the interior into something externally legible. That labor is so constant and so invisible that most people around you have no idea it is happening. The disconnection that comes from that is not a side effect. It is the inevitable outcome of a life lived one layer removed from your own experience, where the energy that might have gone into actually feeling things has been continuously redirected into managing how the feeling appears from the outside. The surface solutions tell you to be more present, as though presence were a choice you had simply forgotten to make, as though the problem were attention and not architecture. But the architecture was built for a reason, and that reason is older than any habit you could correct with 30 days of journaling. To understand where it came from, you have to go somewhere most productivity advice will never take you: into the body itself, and what it learned to do long before you were old enough to decide anything about how you wanted to live. What the body remembers. Before you had language, you had a nervous system. And that nervous system was doing something extraordinarily sophisticated long before anyone around you had the vocabulary to describe it, or the awareness to notice it was happening. It was reading rooms. It was scanning faces. It was making rapid, unconscious assessments of whether the environment around you was safe, whether the people in it could be trusted, whether the version of you that existed in that moment was acceptable, or whether it needed to be adjusted, softened, reduced, made smaller in order for things to go smoothly. This is not a metaphor. It is physiology. The human nervous system is wired, from the earliest stages of development, to orient toward the social environment as the primary source of both threat and safety. The facial expressions of the people closest to you, their tone of voice, the tension or ease in their bodies, all of that was data your nervous system was processing and filing before your conscious mind had any access to it at all. And what it filed, it kept, not as memory you can retrieve and examine, but as a set of learned responses woven into the tissue of how you move through the world. As a background hum of anticipation that colors every new room you enter before you have consciously assessed anything about it. As a reflex older than thought that begins preparing for what tends to happen before you have decided whether preparation is warranted. The body does not distinguish between the past and the present the way the conscious mind does. When you walk into a room that carries the same emotional texture as a room you learned to be careful in a long time ago, your nervous system does not file a footnote explaining that the context has changed. It simply responds. The monitoring begins. The version of you that knows how to make things smooth and legible steps forward, and you go along with it because by now the whole sequence is so fast and so automatic that it does not feel like a choice. It feels like you. For many people who carry this kind of disconnection, the origin story is not dramatic. There was no single event, no obvious wound. It was the accumulation of small moments in which you learned that certain parts of you created friction, and that friction was uncomfortable for the people you loved and needed, and that you were capable of reducing the friction by adjusting yourself, and that adjusting yourself worked. So you kept doing it, because children are nothing if not efficient at identifying what works. The problem is that what works in a system and what is true in a person are not the same thing. The adjustment that reduced the friction also reduced something harder to name, the sense that the full version of you was welcome, and over time, across thousands of these small recalibrations, the distance between the version that was welcome and the version that actually existed became the background condition of your life, so familiar that you stopped experiencing it as distance and started experiencing it simply as yourself. What you called your personality was, in significant part, a very sophisticated adaptive strategy. It was real. It kept you functional and capable of moving through environments that would otherwise have been much harder. But it was built for a specific set of conditions that no longer exist, and it has been running on those old parameters in every new environment you have entered since, which is part of why no new environment has ever quite felt like a rival. You have been waiting to feel at home in a body that learned home meant managing yourself, and you cannot think your way out of that, or journal your way out of it, or reframe your way out of it, because what was learned at the level of the nervous system has to be addressed at the level of the nervous system, something slower and more uncomfortable and more real than anything a productivity framework was ever designed to offer you. The identity you built to survive belonging. You did not decide to adapt. It happened the way most of the things that shape us happen, gradually and visibly through repetition so continuous that the pattern became indistinguishable from personality. You learned what made the room relax. You learned which version of your thoughts landed well and which ones created a particular kind of silence that felt like a door closing. You became fluent in a language that was not entirely yours. The problem is that fluency in a borrowed language over time can make you forget what your native tongue actually sounded like. There is a specific threshold, not a single day, but a kind of before and after which the question of what you actually feel in a given situation became genuinely difficult to answer, not because the feeling stopped, but because the habit of translating them before they reached the surface became so practiced that the original signal and the edited version started arriving simultaneously, and eventually you could no longer tell which was which. Somewhere in the search for the right answer, the actual feeling would wait a moment too long, and then quietly dissolve back into wherever feelings go when no one has time for them. This is what chronic self-editing does at depth. It does not simply hide the self from others. It gradually obscures the self from itself. The performed identity starts to occupy the foreground so completely that the interior becomes hard to access without effort. And the interior that is hard to access is also hard to bring into contact with other people, which means the very strategy you develop to stay connected quietly becomes the mechanism of your disconnection, not from others first, but from yourself, and then from others through that same absence. The particular grief inside this is something most people never quite articulate, even to themselves. It is not the grief of having been rejected. It is the grief of having been so consistently partially accepted that the parts of you which were never brought into the room eventually stopped knocking. The warmth was real. The relationships were real. But they were relationships with a version of you that was composed rather than complete. And somewhere in you, you knew that the acceptance was conditional on the composition holding. The adaptation was not neurotic. It was intelligent. It was the response of a perceptive person to a real social environment that genuinely had preferences about what it could accommodate. The problem is not that you adapted. The problem is that adaptation became the default mode even when the environment changed, even when safety was available, even when the room could actually have held more of you than you offered it. The nervous system that learned to edit did not receive the update that editing was now optional. The disconnection from other people that you experience is not primarily a social problem. It is a sequencing problem. It begins in the interior, in the growing distance between what you actually are and what you have practiced being, and then it expresses outward as an inability to feel genuinely close even when proximity is available. The glass wall is not between you and other people. It is between you and the full version of your own experience, and it was built with your own hands, for reasons that made complete sense at the time. Why meaning stopped working. There was a version of the future that used to feel like it had direction, not a 5-year plan, but a general orientation, a sense that effort accumulated into something, that the shape of a life could eventually resolve into something coherent and earned. And then, at some point difficult to locate precisely, that orientation became harder to feel. The future stopped pulling. Not because you became lazy or gave up, but because you started thinking too clearly to accept the stories that were holding the direction together. The meanings that most people inherit arrive pre-assembled. Career as identity, relationship as completion, social status as evidence of worth, productivity as virtue. These frameworks function well enough for people who can hold them without examining them too closely. But for someone whose mind tends toward precision, toward the gap between what is said and what is actually happening, these inherited structures have a particular vulnerability. They do not survive sustained examination, And once you have examined them carefully enough to see the scaffolding, you cannot unknow what the scaffolding is made of. This is not cynicism. That distinction matters more than most people who experience it are ever told. Cynicism is a conclusion. What you experienced is something categorically different. It was a perception. The scaffolding became visible not because you decided to distrust it, but because your mind was precise enough to see it. The job felt hollow, not because work cannot be meaningful, but because the particular form it was taking had nothing to do with anything that mattered to you in the hours when you were being honest. The relationship felt incomplete not because connection is an illusion, but because the version of yourself you were bringing to it was the edited version, and edited versions cannot receive love at depth. The problem was never that meaning is unavailable. The problem was that the available forms of meaning were not built to the right specifications, and no one handed you the tools to build something that was. So you stayed in the wreckage of the inherited structures longer than was useful, because the alternative, starting from the actual ground of what you are, and constructing something true from there, was a project with no map and no guarantee. What tends to happen in that space is a particular kind of stagnation that gets mistaken for depression or nihilism. It has some of the texture of both, but the diagnosis is wrong. What is actually happening is that a person whose meaning-making system was built on someone else's architecture has correctly identified that the architecture is inadequate, has not yet built a replacement, and is living in the interval between those two things without a framework that can make sense of the interval itself. The interval is not empty. The precision that dissolved the inherited frameworks is the same precision that could build something more honest. The refusal to be satisfied by surfaces is a specification, not a failure of gratitude. It is the mind insisting, with a persistence that survives every attempt to override it, that depth is not optional, and that a life lived primarily on the surface is not something it will agree to call enough. That insistence is inconvenient. It is also, in the precise sense of the word, the most valuable thing about you. The hidden cost of emotional intelligence. Seeing people clearly is a gift that arrives without instructions, and by the time you understand what you are carrying, you have already been carrying it long enough that you cannot remember what it felt like not to. You know things about people before they tell you. You notice the hesitation that arrives a half-second before the confident answer. You feel the tension underneath the polite surface of a conversation that is performing ease it does not actually contain. The information arrives whether you want it or not, as automatic and as uninvited as the physical sensation of cold. High emotional intelligence is routinely described as a gift, and in the framework of individual skills, it is. But the description stops short of something important. The same capacity that allows you to read a room with precision also means you cannot fully rest inside one. Every social environment carries information that your system processes continuously, the undercurrents of unspoken feeling, the micro-expressions that contradict the macro-narrative, the emotional weather that everyone else experiences as background, and you experience as foreground. The calibration does not have an off switch. The particular loneliness that comes from this has almost no vocabulary in ordinary social life, which is part of why it compounds the isolation it describes. It is not the loneliness of someone who lacks connection. It is the loneliness of someone who sees too clearly for most connections to feel complete. You can be in a conversation that is, by every external measure, warm and reciprocal, and simultaneously feel a slight remove because you can perceive the layers underneath it that the conversation is not touching. Most people do not notice that gap. You cannot stop noticing it, which means you spend significant portions of your social life in a kind of frustrated proximity, close enough to feel the absence of depth, aware enough to know that naming the absence would break the thing you are trying to be close to. There is also what happens at the level of genuine surprise, which is that you experience less of it than you once did, when you can read people's motivations before they have fully acted on them, when your empathy is precise enough to anticipate the ending of a story from the emotional logic of its beginning. The world loses a specific texture, not wonder exactly, but the particular pleasure of being caught off guard by something human. And in the space where surprise used to live, there is sometimes a tiredness a sense of having processed too much for too long in environments designed for people who process less. What this creates in practice is a person who is deeply capable of connection and also chronically underconnected, not because the desire for depth is absent, but because the conditions that would allow depth are rarer than the desire for them. The continuous experience of being in the proximity of connection, without being able to reach what would feel like contact, produces a particular kind of resignation that gets mistaken for introversion or emotional unavailability, when what it is, beneath those labels, is a very rational response to a long history of reaching and finding the available surface insufficient. You are not too sensitive. What you carry is not primarily reactivity. It is resolution. You are operating with a finer resolution of social and emotional information than most interpersonal environments were designed to accommodate. The disconnection you feel in ordinary interaction is not a failure of your relational capacity. It is a mismatch between the resolution you bring and the resolution the context was built for. That distinction will not make the conversations feel less thin, but it changes what the thinness means, and changing what something means is sometimes the first thing that has to happen before anything else can. The space between who you are and who the world needs you to be. There is a position that certain people occupy not by choice but by accumulation. The position of existing slightly to the side of every room they enter. Not outside, not fully inside, somewhere between the two, close enough to participate and far enough to feel the gap between participation and belonging, has a constant low-grade friction that most people around them seem not to experience at all. You have probably spent years believing this position was temporary, and you have probably at this point begun to suspect that the distance is not accidental, that it has something to do not with the rooms you have been choosing, but with what you are and what the available rooms were built to hold. For most people, the translation between interior and exterior is modest. A slight adjustment of tone here, a strategic omission there, the ordinary social grammar of self-presentation that does not reach deeply enough into the self to disturb anything essential. But for people whose interior is genuinely at odds with the scale of what most environments were designed for, the translation is structural. It requires leaving significant parts of the self outside the room, and doing so repeatedly, across years, in every context, produces a grief that is difficult to categorize because it is not attached to any single loss. The grief of this is not the grief of having lost something specific. It is the grief of a recurring choice, made so many times it stopped feeling like a choice between two things that should not be in opposition, being understood and being accepted. Most people who carry this kind of disconnection have made the first choice more often than the second, not because they preferred it, but because the cost of the second, borne often enough, becomes unsustainable, and the accumulated weight of choosing to be present in a room in a way that kept the room comfortable is one of the things that sits behind the glass. The self that was left outside the room did not announce its departure. It stopped being brought in gradually, across a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in context. And then one day you looked around at the version of yourself present in your own life and noticed that it was, somehow, less than the whole. Not false, but curated in a way that had accumulated into something that felt like a diminishment you could not quite trace to any specific cause. When you do not understand the architecture of your own suffering, the explanation the culture is most prepared to offer is that something is wrong with you, that you are asking for too much, that if you were more adaptable, less intense, you would find what you are looking for. And some part of you, the part that has been monitoring the room for most of your life, knows exactly what adjustments would make that narrative land better. So you consider making them. Sometimes you make them, and then you feel further away than before. The gap between who you are and who the world has needed you to be is not a wound in the clinical sense. It is a measurement. It is the distance between the scale of your interior life and the capacity of the available environments to hold it. The interior that does not fit in ordinary rooms is not defective. It is large, and a large thing that cannot fit in a small space is not broken. It simply needs to stop trying to be small. Not broken, differently tuned. There is a question that most of the language around disconnection has never been willing to ask directly. Not what is wrong with you. Not how you fix yourself. The question is simpler and more unsettling. What if there is nothing to fix? What if the experience you have been interpreting as malfunction is not malfunction at all, but signal, a precise and coherent communication from a system that is working exactly as it was designed to work, in an environment that was not designed for it? There is a categorical difference between something being difficult and something being broken. The conflation of those two things, which the culture you were raised inside performs continuously and without examination, has probably been one of the more costly background assumptions of your life. You have been trying to repair something that was not damaged. You have been treating a frequency mismatch as a character defect, and the energy that went into that project is part of what produced the exhaustion you carry now. The psychological profile of people who feel most alien in modern life tends to share certain features that are worth naming, not as symptoms, but as characteristics. A genuine need for depth in experience, for meaning to be present rather than implied, for connection to operate at a level below social performance. A nervous system calibrated for precision rather than speed, which registers the gap between what is presented and what is real as uncomfortable rather than ignorable. A relationship to solitude that is not avoidance but necessity. An inability to sustain genuine engagement with things that do not matter, not as a discipline but as a constitutional fact. The way some people cannot eat certain foods, not from preference, but from incompatibility. None of those features are disorders. In a social context organized around depth rather than speed, around meaning rather than productivity, around interior life rather than curated exterior, those features would not produce disconnection. They would produce belonging of a kind that is genuinely difficult to find in the current arrangement of things. The disconnection is not native to you. It is relational. It is what happens when a particular kind of person encounters a particular kind of world, and the fit is poor. What changes when you understand this accurately is not the external conditions. What changes is the interpretation of your own experience. The disconnection stops being evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you and starts being legible as information about what you need and what the available context is and is not providing. That shift from self-diagnosis to environmental mapping is quiet but significant, because a person who is trying to fix a defect in themselves is pointed in a fundamentally different direction than a person who is trying to understand the conditions of their own experience. The glass wall does not disappear, but when you understand what it actually is, it stops feeling like exile and starts feeling like position. You are standing somewhere specific. The view from that position includes things that are not visible from inside the performance, inside the inherited meaning structures, inside the social architecture built for a narrower range of human experience. The need for depth that has made shallow environments feel suffocating is the same need that, in the right conditions, produces the kind of connection and meaning that most people report never having experienced at all. The disconnection was never the problem. The problem was the story about what the disconnection meant, and that story, having been examined carefully and found to be inaccurate, no longer has to be the one you live inside. You were never behind glass. You were simply waiting for a language accurate enough to describe what you could already see.